We are legion, for we are many. While the Bible is full of stories about demon possession, this one by far is the one that sticks out the most. And the very idea of being possessed by thousands of demons that torment you to the point of being cast off from society to live among the graves, screaming and howling throughout the day while you cut yourself with sharp rocks, is one that is so horrifying that even Hollywood has created several movies about it. This is the passage that we come to in the verse-by-verse study that we are currently doing through the book of Matthew. And in this video, we will be taking an in-depth look at harmonizing the account of this story from not only Matthew, but Mark and Luke as well. And we will also answer the questions that most people have about this passage, which is, why did Jesus send these demons into pigs? And why did they instantly kill themselves once he did? Lastly, we will also be using today's passage to talk a bit about worship, which I know at first sounds a bit out of place in this context, but once I explain how it fits in, I promise that it will all make sense. That said, let's get started. All right, now as always, before we get started, just for those of you that might be new here, I want to take a moment to introduce myself and this channel. I am James West, and this is the Lion's Den Academy, which is all about bringing you closer to God through an in-depth study of His Word. We are currently going through the book of Matthew, like I said, and this is the 40th video in that series, and I would love to have you join the Academy by clicking the subscribe and notification bell below. With that out of the way, let's now start by reading today's passage in its entirety. And that is found in Matthew chapter 8, verses 28 through 34. And it reads, "And when he came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes, two demon-possessed men met him, coming out of the tombs, so fierce that no one could pass that way. And behold, they cried out, 'What have you to do with us, O Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?' Now a herd of many pigs was feeding at some distance from them. And the demons begged him, saying, 'If you cast us out, send us away into the herd of pigs.' And he said to them, 'Go.' So they came out and went into the pigs. And behold, the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned into the waters. The herdsmen fled, and going into the city, they told everything, especially what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And behold, all the city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they begged him to leave their region." Now, I will spend the last part of this video addressing the two apologetic areas that this passage brings up, which is why Matthew records there being two men here, whereas the other gospel writers only mention one, and why Matthew records this as being the country of the Gadarenes, whereas the other gospel writers say it is the country of the Gerasenes. So, if you're interested in that or specifically here for answers to those questions, then just make sure to watch to the end. And speaking of Matthew describing the two men, whereas the others only mention one, despite that fact, I think that the way that the other gospel writers describe the man that they do focus on, it does certainly apply to both of the men mentioned in Matthew here in all but one way. And I will focus on that difference here in a bit. But for now, let's focus on their similarities, which was how this legion of demons affected them. In verse 28, Matthew tells us that they were coming out of the tombs so fierce that no one could pass that way. Mark 5, 3 through 5 gives us a bit more information to go on as well, which says, "He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him any more, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones." Luke 8:27 also tells us that for a long time he had worn no clothes, and he had not lived in a house but among the tombs. So, they lived in tombs, which, just to be clear, is like us saying that today that they lived in a graveyard, a place of death that I don't think any one of us in our right minds would want to live. And I'll admit that at first when I read this, I thought that this wasn't of these demoniacs' own doing, but that the townsfolk had simply gotten tired of these men's behavior and being kept up all night by their screaming, and quite possibly that these men had acted out violently to others in the town. So they decided to banish these men to the tombs and tried to hold them there with chains that they would eventually end up breaking free of. However, this is where reading a gospel story from different writers' perspectives makes things more clear. You see, He didn't break free from the chains that were intended to keep him away from the town and in the tombs. He broke free of the chains that the townsfolk used to keep him safe and under their care and in the town. And when he broke free, that's when he ran to that place of death, isolated from human contact. We can see this clearly in Luke 8:29, which says, "For many a time it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the desert." Viewing it from this perspective makes a lot more sense too when we consider what sin does. It makes us want to isolate ourselves, not only from God, but also from other people. And that is a story as old as Adam and Eve, where once they ate of the forbidden fruit, they not only began to hide from one another by covering their nakedness, but they also tried to hide from God. That's the good old bait and switch that the enemy loves doing, tempting you with sin, and then the second you succumb to it, throwing that sin in your face and making you feel full of shame about it, which makes you push that part of you into the darkness where no one can see it. And the more you allow that to happen, the more of you is buried in darkness and isolation. It's no wonder then that in this sin-filled world, we see more depression and more loneliness than ever before. However, just like Christ did to this man, we can also be set free and made into a new person, no matter the depths of our sin. And considering that this man was filled with thousands of demons, which are also described interchangeably as unclean spirits, who are almost, in a sense, making this man a puppet to live in sin, that should give us all a great comfort in knowing that no matter how bad we think we are, we weren't filled with as much sin as this man. And if Jesus can in an instant make this man clean and in his right mind, then we also have complete assurance that he can do the exact same for you, me, or anyone else that you know that is as far from God as you can imagine. As a post I've seen on social media says, Satan knows your name and calls you by your sin, while God knows your sin yet calls you by your name. Going back to the change that these men were bound in, let's take a minute to focus in on that. This, of course, shows the physical strength that these thousands of demons gave to these men. However, while of course being able to literally break chains and shackles is no doubt an impressive feat of strength, since the power to do so came from these demons and not from the hand of God, though, I have no doubt that it left behind physical trauma from doing so. Let me explain what I mean by that. So, when we look at examples of biblical strength being given, such as with Samson, it was no doubt the power and strength of God that was equipping him and infusing him with power to do those feats. With demons, though, they don't equip, instead they use. And just like how engines today, they come with power regulators, to make sure that it's not going to be used at a capacity or speed higher than it can handle before it causes damage to either itself or the user. We as humans also have power regulators built within us as well, through our nervous system and things like that, to make sure that we don't push ourselves to the point of doing things like tearing our biceps, destroying our ligaments or hurting us in other ways. Every now and then, though, we can bypass these limits when we are placed in situations that cause our adrenaline to pump through our veins, which is how in extreme situations, mothers are able to lift a car off their child. However, once the action stops and that adrenaline leaves, then you are fully wiped out and quite likely tore some muscles at the very least. There are other more unnatural things that can cause this too, such as drugs like PCP. So when I was working overseas doing my contracting work, one of my good friends over there, his name was Jeremy Cook, and he told me this story about one such encounter. And before contracting, he not only was a Navy corpsman, but he also spent time in the DEA and as a cop in California. While working as a cop, he had arrested a guy that was on PCP, and once they got him to the precinct or jail or whatever the proper name is, they then handcuffed this guy, hands behind his back, to a metal bench that was bolted to the ground. And this bench, by the way, it was several hundred pounds just in and of itself. Cook then went over to talk to his supervisor about the situation and start the paperwork when he hears this loud metal scraping sound coming from the direction of this man. When he turns to look, he sees this guy on his feet who had managed to use enough force to unbolt the bench from the ground and drag it behind him, all so that he could ask with his jaw clenched, as is the norm for people under the influence of PCP, "Can I get my phone call now?" While he didn't feel a thing at the time, he had unknowingly broken both of his wrists and caused severe ligament damage, though, in that process. So, these men, they broke free of their chains, and unlike the chains that God breaks for us that free us from our burden, sin, and baggage, These chains broke and drove these men to not only live in a depressing location like we discussed, but to also just live a life that just breaks your heart. As Mark tells us, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And Luke tells us that for a long time he had worn no clothes. Now, if you think about it, it really makes the show Naked and Afraid pale in comparison, since this also adds being demon possessed, depressed, and self harm into the mix. Speaking of wearing no clothes, though, while there is no way to know for sure, if I did have to take an educated guess, I would assume that the reason why these demons drove this man to reject wearing clothing is so that it would, one, deter other people from wanting to approach him, and in doing so, thereby increase his loneliness and isolation, and or two, to make him feel less than human. So the last thing I do want to discuss before moving on to the demons is how these men would cut themselves with sharp stones. This man had nothing to do with his life, these men had nothing to do with their life, but to wander around dehumanized and cut off from society. And it's quite possible that, these guys, they were simply just trying to feel something or even check if they were still alive. However, I do think that the more probable cause for this self-harm is that it was something demonically influenced. After all, if Satan can get you to harm yourself, then that is a win in his books. And we can see him and his demons influencing people in the same exact way even today. While these men performing this activity while being possessed with thousands of demons certainly does give a weighty credibility to self-cutting being demonically influenced, we can also see an example of this in the Old Testament as well, when Elisha challenged the prophets of Baal. And just as a reminder, we were told in Deuteronomy 32:16-17 that certain false gods like this are almost certainly demons. When the prophets of Baal couldn't get a response from their false god, they then resorted to cutting themselves over and over in an attempt to get a response. So that said, let's now take a moment to address the demons inside these men. So in Mark 5:9, Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." The word legion here is the same that is used to describe a Roman legion, which is anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 people, or in this case, demons. Additionally, it was around 2,000 pigs that ran off the cliff, meaning that it was at least 2,000 demons. Yet if multiple demons could possess a man, then most certainly multiple demons could also go into a pig. The fact that there were so many of these demons shows just how great this man's suffering and torment really was. The question that then arises is, well, how did these men end up with so many demons inside them? And I think Matthew 12:43-45 sheds quite a bit of light on that. It reads, "When the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places, seeking rest, but finds none. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds the house empty, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and brings with it 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and they enter and dwell there, and the last state of that person is worse than the first." The key phrase in that passage is that when it comes, it finds the house empty. This means that you can be an unsaved person and have a demon cast out of you, and if you don't accept Christ, then you are simply leaving yourself open for an even worse spiritual and demonic attack. This is because once you are saved, as Paul tells us in Galatians 2:20, it's no longer you who live, but Christ who lives in you. Which means that when the demon tries to come back with his friends, Christ becomes your personal bouncer that says, not in my house.
You're right. That's a 5th floor problem.
Not in my house.
Let's now take a look at this legion's request. In Luke 8:31, they begged him not to command them to depart into the abyss, which, just to be clear, is the holding place for evil spirits that we read about in Revelation. Instead, they asked Jesus to send them into the herd of pigs that was nearby. And Jesus grants them their request. And this, of course, causes us to ask, well, why the pigs? Well, the first thing we have to ask is, why were there that many pigs, an unclean animal according to Israeli law, in Israel to begin with? And the reason for this is that the part of the sea that they were on was a Gentile-controlled area. And these pigs were likely raised by Romans or Greeks, which means that these demoniacs were quite likely not Jewish either. So it wasn't as if Jesus was like, oh yeah, I'll totally send you into these unclean animals that you're then going to kill, and it's like 2 birds, 1 stone. This, of course, though, leads to the question of, well, why did the pigs run off a cliff? And I think we find our answer to that in the results of what happens after they did. After all, what's a demon's objective other than to stir up trouble and to try to prevent people from coming to God, or to try to bring people that are near God away from God? You see, when the demons drove 2,000 pigs off that cliff, that was effectively like them taking that town's pension plan and completely wiping it out, since the amount of wealth that these animals represented would have been vast. So essentially, for these townsfolk, all that they can see from their side of the story is that Jesus shows up, and yeah, they got back two guys that they thought were irredeemable and crazy, but in return, their entire life savings were wiped out. And the response to that showed that they cared far more about their property than they did for people. However, if the pigs hadn't ran off, then quite possibly their reaction would have been completely different. Jesus, though, being fully God in the flesh, certainly knew that these demons would kill all these pigs and cause all that trouble, though. Yet at the same time, Jesus valued this man's life being restored vastly over the lives of these animals. So the death of these pigs, it not only stirred up some hostility with the townsfolk here, but the healing of these men also provoked a great deal of fear in them as well, and rightly so. After all, we are talking about the very presence of the holy nature of Jesus. And when Jesus comes into the presence of unholiness, then people are instantly filled with terror because it's like a piercing light that is shining on all the ways that they fall short. And in response, they then plead or beg with Jesus to leave. This is the natural response that those who are afraid of the holy nature of Jesus give. We see this even with Simon Peter when Jesus performed the miracle of having them toss their nets onto a different side of the boat, which caused there to be such a large catch that the boat started to sink from the weight of all the fish. And in response to such a miracle, he then fell to his knees and said, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man."
Put that down for a catch. A little farther out.
I don't have a quarrel with you, teacher. But we've been doing this all night. Nothing. All right. At your word.
Let's go!
My brother and the baptizer. You are the Lamb of God, yes?
I am.
Depart from me. I am a sinful man. You don't know who I am and the things I've done.
Don't be afraid, Simon.
Now, if you recall from earlier, I mentioned that the other gospel writers of this story were a bit different in what they focused on, and that it was only one of these men. And the man that they focused on was the one that we do read about in Mark 5:18 through 20, who, after being cleansed, begged Jesus that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. This is very different from Jesus' usual response to the other people that he healed, whom afterwards he would then instruct them to not say a word. Yet those people were Jewish, and Jesus was simply being smart with his ministry, whereas this person and his people were Gentile, and as such they wouldn't be stirring up the Sanhedrin to interfere with the work that he was doing in the land of God's chosen people before he knew it was time. So The last thing that I want to talk about in the story before addressing those two apologetic areas is how the demons approached and addressed Jesus, since this is something that I feel most of us Christians fall short on. And yes, you heard that right. Let's take a look at Luke 8:28 to see what I mean. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him and said with a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Did you catch that? This demon-filled man fell down before Jesus, like knees on the ground, face to the floor, submission. What I would like to ask you all is when, if ever, have you prostrated yourself like that to Jesus in prayer, fully submitting to him and his will when talking to the Son of the Most High God? Because if you haven't, and you aren't, then what you're saying is that your worship to God is subpar to that of demons. And I don't know about you, but that's not how I want my worship to be classified. So what makes me worry that so few have ever done this is what I see when I look around the church during worship. Now, I will say that my church personally has a great, fantastic worship team that is absolutely amazing, and the congregation is full of more worshipers than I've seen in any other church that I've personally been to. But from what I've seen as a whole, a good number of people either try to time their arrival at church to miss worship, or they will view it as something that they simply have to stand through so that they can then sit down and receive the message of the day. Or as my pastor says, they stand there with their resting Bible face, which is usually accompanied with hands in their pockets or arms folded across their chest. This, my friends, is absolutely unacceptable. We are to praise as a sacrifice. Yes, no longer we don't have to bring animals to the slaughter, in order to be atoned for our sin, and Christ's blood shed on the cross is the living sacrifice that trumps all others and makes them obsolete. But at the same time, we are absolutely called to praise and worship God. As Hebrews 13:15 tells us, through him then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God that is the fruit of the lips that acknowledge his name. And it doesn't matter if you think that you have a terrible singing voice. For any of us that are parents, we know that our kids singing a song about how much they love us, it's the sweetest music to our ears, despite how tone deaf they might be. And that is exactly how our Heavenly Father views our singing to him. And if your excuse for not singing is that you don't know the songs, then not only can you at least throw your arms up in the air, but since most worship teams do rotate a certain set of songs, you can get that list from them and hopefully then add more of your own. And I know this might sound shocking to some of you, but you can actually listen to those and worship alongside them even outside of the church. And in fact, I would encourage all of you to do this if you aren't already. Now, I'm not saying that you never can listen to secular music by any means, but you'd be surprised at the impact that at the very least, starting your morning drive, singing to and listening to worship will have on the entire rest of your day. And while I'm not saying that it should be anyone's standard by any means, personally, worship music is all I listen to 99% of the time, even when I'm working out. And I would challenge you to give that a try for at least 30 days and see what impact that has on your joy, patience, and walk with God. So that said, I do want to end this study with the bit of apologetic areas like I mentioned, and in the sense of really covering some areas in this passage that some view as discrepancies when comparing them to Mark or Luke's account. And those two areas are that Matthew points out that there are two men possessed with demons, whereas Mark and Luke only describe one, as we mentioned, and also how Matthew notes that the location that this takes place is being the country of the Gadarenes, whereas in Mark and Luke, it is recorded as the country of the Gerasenes, which, despite these sounding similar but being different, the biggest issues is that this causes for some is that the location that Mark and Luke mention is actually 30 miles inland from the Sea of Galilee, which when we read about the pigs leaping off a cliff and into the sea, people will then scoff and make jokes about flying pigs. So both of these differences have caused some to claim that the Bible is full of errors, whereas if you actually just do proper Bible study and your homework, then you can easily make sense of all these differences. So addressing the number of demoniacs first. We need to at first point out just that, because Matthew describes two demoniacs and the others talk about one, that's not a real discrepancy. In fact, if anything, all it does is add to the authenticity that this is the exact same situation told from the perspective of three very different people. each of which was focusing on a different thing in the moment and wanting to convey their experience of the situation to us readers in their own unique way, inspired by the hand of God. In fact, if you ask any detective, if the testimonies of everyone that they interview all sound the exact same word for word, then the hairs are going to go up on the back of their neck, and they're instantly going to automatically assume that it's because that everyone has come up with and corroborated a story together. Whereas if the story is told from each person's own unique perspective, then they would feel confident that each person is simply telling the truth. We also have to keep in mind that it was 100% God's will that there would be 4 Gospels. And there are reasons why he designed his word so that some of the Gospels would include stories that others do not, and reasons why the stories that are shared in a different way when they are written by more than one Gospel writer. Some of this is also due to the author's personality and voice coming through in their writings. Since we are focusing on the book of Matthew here, let's focus on how that relates to him. And to do that, let me bring up 2 other stories where his personality comes through when compared to the other gospel writers. First, let's take a look at the animals involved on Palm Sunday. And in chapter 21, verses 1 through 3 of Matthew, we read, "Now when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, 'Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord needs them, and he will send them at once.'" So, Matthew points out and records both the donkey and the colt, whereas the other gospel writers will only mention the colt being requested and brought to Jesus. So let's also take a look at Matthew 20, 29 through 34, which says, "And they went out of Jericho, a great crowd followed behind him. And behold, there were 2 blind men sitting by the roadside. And when they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, 'Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David.' The crowd rebuked them, telling them to be silent, but they cried out all the more, 'Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David.' And stopping, Jesus called to them and said, 'What do you want me to do for you?' They said to him, 'Lord, let our eyes be open.' And Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes, and immediately they recovered their sight and followed him." So, as Matthew points out, there are 2 blind men here. Let's see how Mark records this encounter in chapter 10, verses 46 through 52 of his book, or gospel. "And they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.' And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent, but he cried out all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' And Jesus stopped and said, 'Call him.' And they called the blind man, saying to him, 'Take heart, get up, he is calling you.' And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, 'What do you want me to do for you?' And the blind man said to him, 'Rabbi, let me recover my sight.' And Jesus said to him, 'Go your way, your faith has made you well.' And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way." Luke also only points out the one man, whom apparently was more of a notable figure since they actually knew his name. So Matthew records 2 demon-possessed men, 2 animals that Jesus requested on Palm Sunday, and he records 2 blind men that Jesus restored sight to, whereas the other gospel writers only focus on 1. Why do we think that is? Well, it certainly isn't that he is right and the other gospel writers are wrong, or vice versa. And despite these differences, it by no means that one was telling the truth while the other wasn't. After all, if there were 2 men in a room and one person says there are 2 men in that room, while another one says there is a man in that room, both of which are telling the truth. It's only when someone says that there is only 1 man in that room that an untruth is involved. To understand why Matthew records things the way he did, all we really have to do is remember what his profession was before he was called to be a disciple of Jesus. He was a tax collector, someone that was very good with the numbers and very meticulous with them, to the point that the Romans were willing to pay him a very sizable wage to bleed his fellow countrymen dry.
We live in the same world, Matthew.
Next.
Besides, what else are you gonna do with a mind like yours?
What's the tablet for?
I grabbed it without thinking. You can put it back.
No, keep it. You may yet find use for it.
Moving on to our next area of apologetics, let's now focus on the location that they were at. And in verse 28, Matthew says, "And when he came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes." However, in Mark and Luke's gospel, they say that this is the country of the Gerasenes. So, how do we harmonize this? Well, I think that there are two main solutions in doing so. The first, which I think is the most probable in my opinion, is that the location that this took place was quite likely a small town called Gergesa, which was actually in the territory of Gadara, or country of the Gadarenes. The solution is actually as old as scholars such as Origen, who explained how this was a good example of how the Bible writers weren't too concerned with recording the precise locations of where things took place that they weren't intimately familiar with, where they were at. Although it shouldn't, quite be a shock to any of us that out of the three synoptic gospel writers, it was Matthew that at least got the territory right. From a geographical standpoint, though, this solution makes the best sense too, since Gergesa was located midway on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And it's really the only area that has the key features to support this story, which are steep hills that drop off into the sea, as well as a series of caves and tombs where the demon-possessed men lived. Nowadays, this location is called Cursa or Gersa. The second solution to this is that in each gospel account of the story, they always say the country of or the region of, but they actually don't specify an actual place. This is very similar to what we even do today when we are talking to someone about where we grew up or where we live. If we're talking about a place that not everyone would know or they would be familiar with. So, for example, a while ago I lived in Fishers, Indiana, which is a good 20 miles from downtown Indianapolis. And anyone from the Indianapolis area, I could tell them Fishers, and they would instantly know what I'm talking about. But to someone not from Indiana or not familiar with Indiana, instead I would say that I lived in Indianapolis, since they would be able to instantly get a general idea as far as where I was talking about. And with that, I will wrap up today's study. As always, I do hope that you found this informative, engaging, and hopefully a bit entertaining as well. If so, please leave a like and a comment just to help YouTube push this content to others that might need to hear it. And if you've made it all the way through this video as long as this, and you haven't already subscribed, then I know this type of content is right up your alley. So I'd love for you to join us on future videos by subscribing and clicking the notification bell below. Lastly, I do want to give a bit of an announcement on a new project that I felt called to do, and that is writing a book about the basics of Christianity. I had already planned on writing a book on the book of Matthew, using all the notes from these videos, once I do finish, going through all the book of Matthew verse by verse here with you. But God actually woke me up in the middle of the night a few nights ago and gave me this sort of, matrix style type of information dump on this, structure of this other book. And, it really filled me with passion and everything to get that out. So I'm excited to bring that all together. That said, I do look forward to seeing you all the next time when we start on chapter 9. But until then, God bless and keep you.